your program, you will find a biography of Dr. Perls, and it says he's a geriatrician at Boston Medical Center and associate professor of medicine at Boston University School of Medicine. He's a fellow of the American College of Physicians. He grew up in Colorado, went to school at Pitzer College, at the Claremont Colleges in California, and attended medical school at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. When I first met Tom, both of us were crazy enough to be in Colombia. We were in Bogota, Colombia, at the time when the cartels were still doing their thing, and as we drove down the streets, there were soldiers with guns. But we were there at the behest of a public health agency of that country. And it was a very interesting group of people that were collected there. And at the time, Tom spoke about the Centenarians and about his interest in them and about the Boston studies. And I was captivated by that, but even more so by the second topic that he talked about, particularly because we had a couple of practitioners of anti-aging medicine with us. So we had the scientists on the one hand and what I might say are some of the quacks on the other. And Tom took some strong pot shots, and those of you who have Googled him know that he has been in a few lawsuits and he's a very strong, outspoken person with respect to the need for people to beware and to be cautious about those kinds of things. So I think we're in for a most interesting talk this evening, and I was just delighted when Tom said yes when we asked him to come and join us tonight.
Thank you very much, Gloria, and Nina, and Andrew, and Margaret as well, for this really fantastic honor. I'm pausing for a second because I have to digest that little visit to Colombia. It was quite an adventure with bomb-sniffing dogs and everything else around us. And a few guards who were carrying guns larger than what Clint Eastwood would carry. Anyway, but without any incident, and it was a really fantastic trip. Colombia is also interesting because the area of Medellin was pretty famous at one time for potentially having quite a few centenarians. And my collaboration with folks in Canada really began with a very early interest in what seemed to me to be a pretty high concentration of centenarians on Prince Edward Island. And I got together with Chris McKnight and Ken Rockwood and actually found an actuarial high up here in Canada to try and find out what was going on there. I might speak a little bit to that in a little while. The Acadians may have something quite special there. So I'm hoping to find Ken later. I thought that Margaret's comments about the 104-year-old were really, really interesting, and also about the kids were a little bit of an anomaly, as you can see. So I'm going to give you what I think looks like a little bit of an academic talk with my apologies, so that I have a bunch of slides, but hopefully you'll be entertained, and I guess since Gloria prodded me with those introductory remarks, I might have to say a few comments about anti-aging quackery. All right, next slide, please. Oh, I think I can do this. I have the power. So I'm going to talk a bit about the demographics of centenarians, a little bit about their age claims, and some of their what we call phenotypic characteristics, or their biological and medical characteristics that we know about. A hypothesis that many of you know about called the compression and morbidity hypothesis, and whether that fits. And centenarians as a hook for promoting healthy aging. So with regard to our New England Centenarian study that I began back in around 1995, we've accumulated close to 2,000 centenarians. Obviously, many of them have passed away. Really, only about 10% of our sample at any one time is alive, because there really is quite a mortality. But we've had a number of subjects who have been in the study for 10 years. And I think it's important just so that you get a feel for the kind of ages we're dealing with. These are people, again, who are living 30 or 40 years past the median age for their birth cohort. So just to show this a little bit more, if you look at the median age of survival of being 67 years for people born in 1900, and then if you look at people who lived to about 92, that represents about 5% now of the cohort. And I must say it was interesting when the band was mentioning that they had 2 World War II survivors. When I started the study, we were interested in World War I survivors. And I think at the time in 1995, there were about 7,000 World War I survivors in the United States. And I was just surprised how quickly that number disappeared. And I think in England, and in the United States, we just lost our last World War I survivor. So over that period of time. But so 5% up to age 92. And then if you look at people live to 100, about 0.2% of that Perth cohort gets to be 100. So when people talk about studying longevity, you may see studies of people in their 80s, or they might call the oldest old, age 85 and older. Well, about age 84 is average life expectancy in Vancouver and British Columbia, so I wouldn't quite call that the oldest old if that's really average around here. So I'm more of a fan of when we start talking about the oldest old, we really are interested in folks about 100 and older. So I lead a couple of studies. One is the Long Life Family Study. I'm actually a co-leader, where there's 3 studies, 3 sites in the United States and 1 site in Denmark of studying. That number's a bit wrong. Maybe I was a little over-optimistic, but we do have about 4,900 family members, but that are made up of about 550 families. And we use a special scheme to see who gets to be enrolled in that in terms of ranking families for their clustering for exceptional longevity. That's the Hubert family, which is one such family with these ages. A couple of these people are, well, I'd say more than half of them are still alive. The study started in 2006. It just took a little while to get things up and running. And then we have the New England Centenarian study, which I've already mentioned to you. And over the past, I'd say 4 years, we've really been centering our attention on people living to about 105 and older. 100 is just too young. So, and even above 107, we started to get interested in what we call super centenarians, people 110 and older. That's Walter Bruning, who up until just very recently was living up in Great Falls, Montana, and who was just amazing. He, I guess when I met him, was 115, and we had to do all kinds of things, as I'll mention, to prove his age. You have to be very, very careful about ages claimed above 115. 99% of age claims of 115 and older are false. But he indeed is that age, and I was just amazed how sharp he was. He would go 90 minutes nonstop talking and never repeated himself, had amazing things to say, and just was just really inspiring. So I think he passed away at the age of 115, and just really had remarkable things to say about the Depression, was really quite annoyed by people talking about how bad things were, how things were with the unemployment and what have you lately, compared to what they went through during the Depression, when people like him found themselves actually going out into the prairie and collecting grass and boiling that as that evening's meal. There were a huge number of people coming up to Montana for work on the railroad at the time. Just had a lot of really interesting stories, and would remark, today is a good day, every day is a good day, and I think that's probably true when you're 114 years old. So the oldest person ever that we believe was Madame Jean Comment, lived in the south of France, lived to 122, back in 1997. The closest we've had since then was a woman named Sarah Canals, who lived to 119, who was actually in our study. And since then, we haven't had anybody really come close. So that's how incredibly rare it is to see people achieving these ages. And unlike people living to 100, which is a fairly fast-growing population, when you start getting to 110 and older, that portion of the population really isn't growing all that much in terms of being a percentage of the population. But very interestingly, there she is at 116. And just look how bolt upright she is, how very engaged she is. And I think I show these pictures just to kind of give you a sense of how people age. If they get to 122, well, they're in pretty amazing shape at 116. Sarah Canals, with her great-great-great-grandson, so presiding over 6 living generations, lived to 119, died in 1999, and here she is at 99. And just how amazing she looks at that age. And then here's a smattering of subjects from our study. Most of them are women. About 85% of centenarians are women, 15% are men. The women really win the longevity race, something Mitt Romney should figure out. That doesn't say anything about my politics. In the middle is a centenarian with her 70-ish daughter. And here is Nelson McNutt. They all have really interesting names, but he wasn't in my study. He's 103 in this picture. He was living in my town and got wind of me, and he called me up and said, "I need a doctor." And he hadn't had a doctor until then. And unlike Margaret, who can claim she kept her patient alive, he died a couple of years later. And he's telling me there in his garden that the trick to getting to these ages is the Brussels sprouts he was growing in his garden. And I think it was more that he was growing them than the Brussels sprouts themselves. And I hate Brussels sprouts, so I don't know if there's much hope for me. A few other thoughts here are, the women tend to be a bit on the short and stocky side, a bit like the Queen Mum. A lot of them are like that. There's exceptions. There's always exceptions. We learned that maybe a little bit of being overweight as you get older is good for you, particularly among women. And there are some interesting hypotheses about being short versus... Now, don't worry. I mean, Mr. McNutt was pretty tall. So if you're tall, you're story is not written. But there are some interesting thoughts about how growth hormone isn't the greatest thing for you in terms of cancer and diabetes and a few other things. I won't get into all the biology. And Mr. McNutt tends to be thin. We don't often see an overweight male. The only other thing I would quickly say, because I don't have that much time, is that even though there are far fewer men than women, they tend to be better off than the women. And the thought is that for a man to get to these extreme ages, they have to be in incredibly good shape. Because if they get an age-related disease, their mortality associated with that disease is quite a bit higher. And so they tend to be cognitively intact towards the very end of their lives. If cognitive impairment starts to show up, that's kind of a death knell. If they're cognitively intact, then they're immortal. The women, on the other hand, they have this double-edged sword that though many more of them can live to very old age, they also can live with age-related chronic diseases as well. So they do tend to have more disability, like Margaret's patient who had a lot of arthritis. So enough of this picture. So very briefly about age claims. Again, 122 was the oldest ever. To my surprise and dismay, the Scientific American recently had an article about a 130-year-old, and that just was not true. One of the interesting things is if you hear about a 130-year-old, well, why didn't we hear about her when she was 122, when she broke the world's record? So they just kind of pop up, and I do my dutiful thing of sending a little letter to the New York Times or the Boston Globe. They tend to alternate every other year with a claim like this and say you're full of it. There's various reasons that are kind of interesting for why people claim the ages they do. Very rarely is it intentional. There can be a religious myth involved. There can be a village kind of, pride thing going on. But we had a paper on this you can look up, but there's various reasons. One of the more interesting and common ones is kind of a fountain of youth location, like the region between Pakistan and China is this Hunza region, which is where the idea of Shangri-La was born. And so you could have these very, very ancient old people there. So lots of different reasons. I guess one other really fun one that's interesting is this is a postage stamp from Azerbaijan. And back in around the 1960s, we not only had the Cold War, but we had the Age War, where Russia, and particularly out of the Caucasus, which is the birthplace of Stalin, they were claiming these extreme ages of 130 and 140 because they were just a lot better than the western part of the world. So with the centenarians, we had first started the study with the hypothesis that to get to these ages, you naturally have to live the vast majority of your life in very, very good health and compress the time that you're sick towards the end of your life, very much along this line of Jim Freese's compression and morbidity hypothesis. And as time went on, and I had a medical student named Jessie Everett look at the data we'd been collecting, she said, I keep finding a lot of centenarians who had even heart attack or stroke 20 years ago. And that went against the hypothesis. And in fact, she collected a bunch of data and one evening kind of had an epiphany of what to call these people and grouped our centenarians into what she called survivors, delayers, and escapers. So people who had age-related diseases before the age of 80, those who had them after the age of 80, and those that we called escapers who really didn't have any demonstrable disease and all came from Calgary wearing cowboy hats. No, not really, but about, I'd say, 15% of our centenarians are these escapers, and many of those are the ones actually that go on to be much, much older. But that's not to say that the delayers and the survivors aren't just as interesting, because while you might think, well, what's so great if many of them, 80% of them, are having these chronic diseases, which goes along with the fact that many of them are the women. But the issue is that over 90% of them are functionally independent at the average age of 93. So they are very interesting for the fact that they're managing these diseases much better than average older people. I don't know if that's because the diseases are significantly less. Maybe they had a heart attack, but they didn't have clogging of all three vessels. Maybe they just had one vessel, a coronary vessel clogged or what have you. But for whatever reason, they're managing the diseases better, and they're not so much delaying morbidity, but they're certainly delaying disability. So instead of this notion of the older you get, the sicker you get, I proposed this phrase that was really quite an optimistic view of aging, of the older you get, the healthier you've been. Now, this graph simply, as we started to get more really old people, so, we had a lot of 100-year-olds for a while, and then we collected a bunch of people over 105. Nobu Hiroshi, Johanna's here, she went and studied centenarians up in northern Japan, but there's a guy there at a university in Tokyo who came up with the term of semi-supercentenarians, people 105 to 109, and then we have our supercentenarians who are 110 and older. And if you look at the proportion of people who are incurring various diseases, and you find that a much greater proportion of people who are going to be 110 were these escapers. And so they lived to age 100 without demonstrable age-related diseases. And then you see a smaller number who were our delayers and survivors. To show that a little bit more clearly, well, let me just put one more thought out there. And that is, so what I've tried to show you, all the gerontologists here know that aging is an incredibly heterogeneous trait. All you have to do is look at the person right next to you, and don't do that because what I'm about to say won't be nice. But we all age very differently. And some of us age a little bit more quickly than others. Some of us have some things that happen in the past 6 months that make us feel that we age a lot faster. On the other hand, some people handle those things like stress much, much better. So at least to get to 100, it seems, where you have survivors and delayers and escapers, it's very, very heterogeneous. But it's also interesting that when you get to these most extreme ages, they get very homogeneous. And that kind of goes along with being at the tail end of anything. That generally, when you're at the most extreme of whatever trait you're looking at, those extremes tend to be quite homogeneous. And that's the case with supercentenarians, where they're quite alike in terms of this marked delay or escape of disability and age-related diseases. And I've just put up there some of the prevalences of these illnesses, which in some cases, like heart attack, are very rare. But that's because also, if they do get a heart attack, they probably pass away at that point. But these kind of data started to give us a clue that maybe when we were looking at the compression and morbidity hypothesis, and when Jim Fries was looking at it, he wasn't looking at an old enough age. That 100 really isn't the limit of human lifespan. 122 is, and 110, which is vastly, vastly more rare than 100, like 1,000 times rarer. That's probably, for all intents and purposes, the limits of lifespan, and that's when we thought at this point that we were seeing the compression morbidity hypothesis being true. So when we did have enough 110-year-olds, we looked at some survival curves and looked at disease-specific survival curves, looking at how old people were before they started to develop various diseases. The graph on the left is looking at age of onset of cancer. The black line are controls, which very interestingly are spouses of our offspring generation. And even though they're a younger generation, 20, 30 years younger, they're still developing age-related diseases at an earlier age than our centenarians. And you remember, if they're 20 or 30 years younger, they're also benefiting from better health care, better socioeconomic status, more years of education, because they're young, they were born later, and yet they're still developing these diseases. And maybe part of this is there was more smoking in that generation. I'm not sure, but we see this pattern in other diseases. So these are the controls here. And then the red line are nonagenarians, people in their 90s, who are actually quite a bit better than here, in part because of the brothers and sisters of our centenarians. And then the next lines are the centenarians, semi-supercentenarians, and supercentenarians. So you see a progressive delay in age of onset, and we see that for cardiovascular disease, which is the next graph here. And then you see that for activities of daily living, which is the Barthel Index. So that's physical disability. And you also see the pattern for cognitive function, which is the blessed is a kind of a crude measure of cognitive function. And you see a progressive delay in the age of onset of cognitive impairment in these individuals as well, with increasing age. So another really interesting way to look at that, for those of you who like studying this stuff, is to try and look at the age at which, for example, 25% of your cohort has developed a disease. And you see that that age increases to older and older age for if you are getting a chance to live to older and older age. So here's a picture of my friend Jim Fries, who's now smiling because his compression and morbidity hypothesis has finally been proven. And this is overall morbidity, where we took a whole bunch of diseases together, and if any one of those diseases showed up, then that would be the age of onset, and we just see that coming along. And then here in this graph, in this table, is the percentage of the person's life spent with where one of those 6 age-related diseases that we looked at appeared in the person's life. And when they're a supercentenarian, it's only their last 5% of their lives. And I think you might say, well, why the heck is Perls spending so much time on this topic? Well, this compression morbidity hypothesis is a big deal for not only biological reasons and why we start looking at genetics and so on, but it has some implications for healthcare policy. And the idea is that there's things that we can do to get people to older age. It might actually be a good deal. As I had mentioned to Margaret briefly before the talk, there's a wonderful researcher named Eileen Crimmins at University of Southern California, spends a lot of time thinking about the healthcare policy ramifications of the population getting older and older. Right now, with an average life expectancy of about 81, 82 years, as people get older and as the population gets older, there is still an increase in disability and healthcare costs. Now, this sounds a little outrageous, but I think once we start seeing average life expectancies of about, maybe Vancouver and British Columbia is getting kind of close, but once we start seeing average life expectancies of about 86 or 87, I think that's the sentinel chicken of the population getting older because it's healthier. And then, as a result, the healthcare costs are less. People are naturally compressing the time they're sick towards the end of their life. I tell you, for a person to die in their 70s, they have to be really sick with a lot of chronic illness, much of it due to smoking. But then maybe also, a lot of other things, like thinking, if you're living down in Mississippi, that a fried Twinkie is a delicacy. But, being not exercising, getting overweight, having terrible diets, eating way too much red meat, smoking, doing things that are very stressful, and so on and so forth. These are things that make people die in their 70s. If we get rid of that stuff and we start seeing a lot more people living into their mid to late 80s, I think we start seeing a compression of illness, healthcare costs, all kinds of good things. I'm going to skip a few things. I'll skip that part. But, well, I should go back to this because there's my president. So one of the other interesting things we did is we looked at personality traits because there's these hypotheses that longevity and healthy aging can be associated with certain personality traits. For example, being low in neuroticism. Those who are less neurotic, they tend to not dwell on things. They don't internalize stuff that's stressful. They're more easily let go. And of course, that may also translate into decreased rates of things like heart disease, hypertension, stroke, maybe even Alzheimer's disease and cancer. And then on the other side of the coin is maybe being more extroverted. And that allows you to perhaps have more relationships, friends. Having other people around you means more cognitive stimulation, more interaction, but also improved safety nets. And in fact, lower neuroticism and elevated extroversion are what we see among our, at least the offspring of our centenarians, those who we went through this huge, long questionnaire, didn't want to subject our centenarians to this five-factor NEO. And I guess I should explain, this is the openness with President Obama. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but he's still a heck of a lot better than the other guy. And then I know something's going to come and bite me for this, but that's Gandhi, this guy. And this is a professor in our geriatric section who's just the nicest guy in the world, and so I'd say he's very agreeable. And then Woody Allen, who's incredibly neurotic. I mentioned the Seventh-day Adventist Health Study because Seventh-day Adventists as a group have among the highest average life expectancy of any group I know of about 88 years. And it's probably by virtue of the fact that they have these very good health behaviors in common. They're vegetarian, they regularly exercise, they don't smoke. They spend a lot of time with family and religion, which may help them manage their stress better. And yet they're a very geographically and ethnically heterogeneous group. So to me, it's these health-related behaviors that are getting to these ages. And as a result, in terms of how much is longevity is nature versus nurture, I think that the vast majority of us getting to our mid to late 80s is going to be environmental and the health habits, because that's what the Seventh-day Adventists show us. So we get, more than 99% of our genetic makeup we have in common with one another. And so there's this baseline genetic blueprint that in the presence of optimal environment, which I think many of us are able to achieve these days with socioeconomic status, indoor plumbing, trying not to smoke, maybe a better diet and what have you, that should get us to about 88 years. And so that's why scientists, when they look at twin studies and others, commonly come up with this number of about 20%, 20 to 30% being genetic, and the remainder being environmental and behavioral. But that's what I would call average longevity. Once you start looking at the ages I'm looking at, then there's been some studies that we've done looking at this clustering for longevity in some families, or that brothers and sisters of centenarians have markedly increased rates of getting to being centenarians themselves, and a number of other things that make us believe that the genetic component gets greater and greater at these older and older ages. So I've got this life expectancy calculator on the internet at livingto100.com that I started back in 1999. I wish I was as astute with knowing what else was going to happen with internet companies that I should have done something else. But this has been free ever since, and it has a little bit of advertising so I can pay for the server. One time, a growth hormone advertisement showed up on there. Oh, I was really upset. That never happens anymore. But it's really based upon the Seventh-day Adventist study. And, you know, if you do everything right, like those traits, it gets you to those late 80s. You know, 89 for a woman and 86 for a man. And then if you have some longevity in your family, it adds a bunch. But if you smoke a cigarette, it takes 15 years off. There's one cigarette, that's all it takes. Because I get really upset about smoking. And after it gives you your life expectancy, it also tells you the things you're doing right and wrong, and it gives you a prescription to take to your doctor for maybe some of the things according to your age in terms of vaccinations and screenings that you should do. And this is what I had put in the outline at the end about, you know, living to 100 is kind of being a hook to promote healthy aging. And if you start showing that this is actually a very optimistic, positive thing, and, you know, when I was a kid, I thought living to 60 was ancient, and I was also told that the older you get, the sicker you get, so I thought, why bother? Right? So, and you still hear people, particularly in Mississippi, who say, you know, I'm going to smoke, and I love it, and I'm going to die at 60, and that's fine. Well, no, you're going to die in your late 70s of emphysema, and it's going to be horrible. So I try and push the notion that taking good care of yourself is probably worth it. Here's that picture of Sarah Knaus and her family, and with Kitty, and this is Sarah at 118, Kitty, her daughter, at age 99, who then became a member in our study. We have two families like that. The 77-year-old grandson, the 47-year-old great-granddaughter, the 23-year-old great-great-granddaughter, and the 2.5-year-old great-great-grandson. Great-great-great-grandson. So I'm almost done, but very briefly, we have done some studies, some genetic studies, in which we looked for genetic variations that the centenarians have in common. And it turns out that, you know, there isn't one gene. And we all know aging is such a complex trait. To think that one gene gets people to these very old ages is very unlikely. And whether it be cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, or something great like living to very old age, it's never going to be one genetic variant. It's going to be many genetic variants with modest effects. And we came up with a statistical method of taking into account many variants. In fact, we found about 281 variants that did a pretty good job of figuring out who was a centenarian and who was a control, just based upon genetic information. And the older the people got, that's the sensitivity, the better this model got at being able to predict who was who just based on genetic information. But before you go out and do this personal genomics crap, pardon my French, and I call it that because, you know, they talk about you're going to get a cheek swab, and for $450, we're going to tell you what your risk for diabetes is, what your risk for this is and that. They can't tell you your risk for breast cancer because there's a patent on it. And that's probably the one place where that would have been really helpful, because this BRCA1 and BRCA2 are really quite sensitive and specific. But what we have found is that the centenarians have just as many disease-associated genetic variants as everybody else, except for a few exceptions like this apolipoprotein E4 that's associated with Alzheimer's disease, which is pretty rare in centenarians. But on the other hand, if I remove that variant out of that model, it doesn't do anything to the model. So it still has a pretty small effect, and that's because it's the disease variant, not the longevity-associated variant. the problem is these centenarians also have a lot of longevity variants or genes that protect you. And these personal genomic tests, they might tell you if you have a disease-associated variant, but you very may well have a protective variant that trumps it. And you may also you might be running and taking good care of yourself, and that could trump it. So I think, and then all these things are very different for Asians versus Caucasians versus blacks versus Hispanics. So I think we are so far away yet in terms of having enough genetic epidemiological data to do the things that these companies are claiming they're able to do. That's not to say that in the future that may be possible, and I think that may be very helpful for like tailoring certain medications, tailoring certain screening and prevention programs and so on. So there's great promise there, but we're not there yet. So last but not least, a la Gloria, because she prodded me now to do this. So it's not so common in Canada, but in the United States, we have this anti-aging industry that is just beyond crazy. And we have, it started with this article in the New England Journal of Medicine by Dr. Rudman, where they looked at just 12 old guys, and they gave them a little growth hormone. I mean, it's unbelievable this thing made it in the New England Journal. And there was one sentence that said it took 20 years off their aging. And thus was born the anti-aging industry and growth and hormone replacement or bioidentical hormone replacement. We've got clinics all over the place. We've got these national and international anti-aging conventions. And then we see these ads where, it takes 80% of wrinkles and off of you. It improves your sexual potency by 80%, which in some people would probably be very, very dangerous. It increases your muscle mass by 60%. It's just these panacea-like claims that are too hard, that are just too good to be true, and obviously they are too good to be true. They sell pills and sprays which don't work. Only injections work for growth hormone. It's just, and there are 50% of people who get growth hormone had adverse side effects, including arthralgias, organ enlargement. 15% develop diabetes. A greater percentage develop hypertension. People who get testosterone, there's this androgel ads in the United States that showed these very large numbers and things, 1.62% androgel, and they've got these weakling guys struggling to put these numbers up on stage, and big husky guys helping them up and stuff. And it's all about anti-aging and getting stronger. And what they don't tell you is the New England Journal of Medicine article that came out a year ago showing that there's a 4 times greater risk of heart attack for people who are taking supplemental testosterone. So anyway, it's just a big, horrible industry. And in Brazil, interestingly, you'll hear tomorrow that they've passed a resolution to ban anti-aging medicine. And they've also are banning hormone replacement and bioidentical hormone replacement, same thing. It's just a funny name to make it sound healthy. Bioidentical hormone replacement for anti-aging. They're also banning Novocaine. There's a stuff called Geravital. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that is actually Procaine, which is the Novocaine dentists use for numbing your gums for tooth work. Well, during the Ceausescu era of Romania, the wife was a doctor and wanted an institute that would make her immortal, and out of that came injecting Procaine for immortality. And it still is around, and it's huge in Brazil, and they've tried to stop that. So you might guess I have something to do with this, and I do, and I'm very happy about it. And I don't know what it'll do in America, but we're going to try and write an article to let people know about what's going on in Brazil. But they're very courageous, and because these people love to sue. And I've been a victim of that too, but fortunately I got out of it okay. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I probably went way over. And thank you very much. Again, it's an honor. I can if you want. You going to take this all hook, line, and sinker?
1, 2.
You can ask about vitamins.
I'm just wondering, when you mentioned about hormonal replacement therapy, what you did say for anti-aging, so that will still exist for menopausal symptoms, or?
Oh, well, no, that's separate. So, at least in the United States, there's been a number of studies that in the endocrinological community, that pretty much you don't see anywhere near the estrogen and progesterone replacement that we were seeing back in the early 90s and earlier for perimenopausal symptoms, which indeed can be very disabling. But because of the increased risks that were being observed for stroke and deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolus, and even heart attack, as well as breast cancer and uterine cancer, that has just fallen way out of favor. Now, for people who have been on estrogen for a long, long time and haven't experienced those, maybe they have a genetic variant that allows them to get away with that, and it's not a problem. But enough excess problems were seen that, people really try and come up with other ways of trying to deal with those perimenopausal symptoms. But with regard to anti-aging, absolutely not. No, don't do that. Use the microphone. I won't hear you.
You mentioned about the Seventh-day Adventists, but I was wondering if you've had any of the, what do they call them, the nun studies?
Oh, yeah.
In those clients?
So the nun study is interesting. That actually started not too far from here in Minnesota and ended up down at the University of Kentucky. And the nun study is most interesting for the fact that when nuns become nuns, they have to write a long essay that's kind of a history it's an autobiography of sorts. And researchers were able to get a hold of these essays, 70, 80 years later, and know who was alive and who had passed away. And they looked at things like the complexity of their verbiage and so on. And they found, almost in a way more years of education, but if there was some kind of measure of intellect, I suppose, they found that those individuals were less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and live longer. But in terms of whether or not nuns generally live longer, I'm not so sure about that. But the nun study was probably most famous for not only the study I just described, but also it's an education sect of nuns. And so they were very, very in favor of this research. And as a result, all of them, when they passed away, donated their brains for study. So they were able to do neuropsych, neuropath correlations, which made that all the more of an interesting and powerful study. Teamwork. It's good.
Very much so. I was interested in the siblings of the supercentenarians and why they lived less, and I was wondering whether that had to do with the context with which the supercentenarians lived in, through a depression and through a period of time where there was some deprivation, let's say. And so if we're looking at it biologically, you would have cells knowing that they needed to die or all of that stuff, and whether that would mean that affluence would somehow not protect you so much from getting to the supercentenarian age.
Alas, wishful thinking. No, I mean, definitely this whole issue of natural selection and survival of the fittest, and maybe though there was actually an interesting study, again, getting back to warriors, looking at Anzac survivors in Australia, and the question of whether the survivors of just some of the most horrific conditions, or for that matter, Holocaust survivors, but this is the study I know of out of Australia, whether they had an increased chance of living to extreme old age because of their demonstrated survival prowess and their ability to adapt and deal with these things. And that study didn't really come up with a finding like that. They all kind of had average life expectancy for their group. So there may be a component of that in terms of certainly your demonstrated ability to adapt, what I would guess would be functional reserve and adaptive capacity and so on. But I wouldn't necessarily take that route with an attempt to get, but it is, it does speak to one very important thing in our studies of very old people, is that it's extremely important to put people into the context of their birth cohort. Because what it takes for a group of people born in 1900 to live to these very old ages can be incredibly different from people born in 1920 or 1940 getting to these old ages, which makes some of our genetic studies quite challenging. There's maybe just a couple more questions because I think people want to go out and party.
You did give an acronym for aging, and you put attitude, genetics, exercise, nutrition, and get rid of smoking. Interest, can you define that more fully?
Oh, interests. I'm sorry that I didn't explain that acronym. I should have. So A is attitude, having to do with whether you're going to manage your stress or let it get to you. G is genetics. And we can all kind of look at the genetics in our family. And people should generally do that. What's running in your family health-wise? So, certainly if there's colon cancer in the family, all the more reason why you should be getting a colonoscopy. Or look at what other disease. If somebody died of smoking-related illness, well, all the more reason why you shouldn't be smoking. I mean, the writing is kind of on the wall, and looking at family history is incredibly important. Along the same lines, if you have some people in your family living into their mid or late 90s, hopefully we're going to come up with some findings in the not-too-distant future here that might get a lot more specific about heritability and the way longevity is passed down from one generation to the next. But I think generally if you have somebody in your mid to late 90s, that's a big plus. And that gives you enough to get your 10 years on the life expectancy calculator. E is exercise. I ask for 30 minutes a day. It's kind of been shown lately as well. And that can be aerobic or resistance training. And as we get older, the resistance training gets even more important because we want to maintain muscle. There was a piece in today's paper about a study that came out of Canada looking at falls, and that only about 20% of falls are due to people tripping or being nudged. The rest of it is just a change in position. And so much of that can be just blamed on decreased muscle mass. So whatever we can do to get people to keep their muscle mass without testosterone, that would be very, very good. So that's AGEI, interest, which is what you wanted to know about, just has to do with not only exercising your muscle, but also exercising your brain. This is a pretty controversial literature still, but this idea that doing things that are both novel, that is new to the brain, but also complex and difficult, may do things like build functional reserve in the brain, which may mean that if you have a problem like Alzheimer's down the road or what have you, it's going to have to cause some additional damage before you see a clinical expression of the disease. So the most difficult thing to do probably would be like learning a new language or a musical instrument. But isn't it interesting that as you do those things, it gets easier? And that may mean that you're actually gaining new connections in the brain, building functional reserve, and that might be very helpful. And then the G is get rid of the smoking and get rid of the anti-aging quackery. Maybe I better get rid of me now. Thank you again.
Great.